Right, okay, morning, everyone. Today I want to quite concisely sum up the main behavioral and social learning theories, mainly by B.F. Skinner and Bandura. Theories that you've probably heard of before, okay, but they're important to consider as part of this course. They really are the second wave of psychology. Okay, the first wave was the psychodynamic perspective, started by Freud, continued by his close followers, really focusing on, the importance of the unconscious. And it really was an influence on all areas of psychology, right? How counseling was done, how research was done, how psychology was taught and understood. And then came this, second wave that in part was to revolt against the psychodynamic perspective. According to B.F. Skinner and the other behaviorists, psychology was unscientific because of the Freudian perspective. They were, looking at abstract ideas, right? In Jung's case, the anima and the animus, or in Freud's case, the id and the superego and the ego. But for the behaviorists, they wanted to focus on overt behavior, that which could actually be observed, that which could be measured, rather than talking in metaphors or about abstract ideas. And again, it's called the second wave of psychology because, again, it influenced all areas of psychology. They completely transformed how counseling was done, how research was done, how personality or psychology was taught, understood. So, John Watson is really given credit for beginning this second wave in psychology. His first text, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, is really thought to be the text that really began this. And then by the time of his biggest success, behaviorism, he had already become quite a popular figure. He was already well known. And, his ideas were quite popular in the US at the time. And his ideas were quite radical. They were quite extreme. They were that you're purely a product of your environment, okay? That there is no real importance on individual capabilities, at least not from a perspective that's looking at predispositions, okay? Everything is a product of you being molded by your environment. And there's a pretty famous quote by John Watson here that, if you give him a dozen healthy infants, he'll be able to guarantee that each one becomes what he wants it to become, okay? That he can make one become a doctor, one a lawyer, one an artist, one even a beggar man, a thief, okay? So that predispositions here don't matter, right? It doesn't matter if there's any predisposition for higher or lower IQ. It doesn't matter if there's any predisposition for particular talents, like in art, okay? For Skinner, you come into the world as a blank slate, right? It's the tabula rasa philosophy, blank slate. So his focus was on measuring overt behavior, right? Really transforming the understanding of psychology, trying to move it into a more hard science, if you like. But his career was cut short early when his affair with one of his students reached the papers. And then B.F. Skinner really came to the forefront following this and was really then the one to kind of spearhead behaviorism following John Watson's departure. So B.F. Skinner wanted to demonstrate Thorndike's law of effects at the core of his ideas. This is basically that organisms respond to encouragements and rewards in the sense that they will be more likely to do those behaviors again because they were encouraged and rewarded. Whereas those that are discouraged or punished, they'll therefore be less likely to do those behaviors. Now, that might seem like pretty common sense, okay? But, sometimes ideas have to be empirically tested, even if they seem like common sense, right? For a long time, it was common sense that the sun orbits around the Earth, right? And then someone actually tested it, turned out it wasn't the case. But also, Skinner would say that in order to actually apply this correctly, you have to have a deeper understanding of it than people initially realize. At a first glance, it seems common sense, but you actually have to understand what's valued by the person in question, right? A teacher, for example, might think that there's a student in their class who's being disruptive. and they'll punish that behavior by sending them to the principal. And therefore, they've discouraged the behavior, they've given a punishment. So they should be less likely to misbehave in the future. But what if the child doesn't care about being sent to the principal? What if they don't care about being told off by the teacher? What if they're getting laughs from their friends, okay, by being called out for this, and this is actually what's more important to them? In that case, the behavior is actually being rewarded and it's actually being encouraged to continue, okay? So in order to actually apply it correctly, you have to understand what matters to the person, okay? Not just use it blindly. He was a controversial theorist because, much like Freud, he believed there's no such thing as free will, okay? You think you have free will, you think you have freedom over which choice you're going to choose or which decision you're going to make, but it's all been predetermined, okay? Because of your earlier experiences, certain things have been encouraged in your past, some things have been discouraged, and it's actually this which is determining the choices you're going to make now and in the future, okay? So a little bit about B.F. Skinner, born Pennsylvania, 1904, from a hard-working family in which he was taught from an early age to fear God, the police, what people will think. He talks about a time when he was a kid and he was taken to the local prison by his dad, and his dad told him, you know, if you misbehave, this is where you'll end up. So, you know, from an early age, he was aware over the consequences to his behavior. He majored in English at Hamilton College. He wanted to become a novelist. This is what he thought he would do, but he found it very difficult to get his first book published. 2 years later, he turned to psychology after reading John Watson's book. This really kind of lit his interest in psychology. And he got his PhD in the topic within 3 years. He then went on to have a pretty successful career in psychology, you know, focusing on behaviorism, was a well-cited researcher. But in his 40s, he fell into a stage of depression. And he finally, at this stage, got his novel published. It's a sci-fi book called World and Two. And for him, this was kind of the cure of his depression. He then felt as though, you know, his ambition, his kind of dream had been fulfilled. And then he continued to work within psychology well into his 80s. By the time, you know, he was at the end of his career, he said he had been cited more times than even Freud in the literature. So, you know, B.F. Skinner is using John Watson's ideas, but also extending them. Okay, so I'm going to begin by talking about what John Watson's ideas were first, and then we'll talk about B.F. Skinner's extensions. But, you know, John Watson's ideas were mainly based upon this work by Pavlov on classical conditioning. It's a study I'm certain you've heard of before at this point, right? In Intro to Psych, I would imagine. But, you know, Pavlov was doing some work on dogs producing saliva. And what he found was not only would the dogs produce saliva in response to being presented with the food, but they would produce saliva in response to signs that the food was coming. Okay, so the footsteps, for example, of the person who would bring them the food. And so when he scientifically tested this, he paired the food with some signs such as the ringing of a bell. And eventually the dog began to associate the two with each other, right? And so just the sound of the bell was enough to produce saliva in the dog, right? Because it had associated the sound of the bell with the food. So, you know, applying this to people, you can think of a whole wide range of ways in which this could be used. For example, you know, maybe you want to teach your young kid to enjoy reading and to, you know, have a positive association with books. Well, you could read to them from an early age and maybe, you know, hug them tight, and then they'll, you know, associate being held close by their parent with reading. And so this will form a positive association that might make them more likely then to enjoy reading. You know, in my own case, you know, I had family all over the UK when I was young, used to do a lot of traveling, but I got a lot of travel sickness. So I had this portable DVD player to kind of keep me busy, to keep me distracted in the car. But if I watched those movies at any point in the future, I would begin to feel sick because I associated the car journey with that movie, right? And that's classical conditioning in action. So in John Watson's best known study, he tested this idea on whether it could instill phobias, okay, which is the baby Albert study. So baby Albert had no fear of rats initially. He was presented with a white furry rat, and baby Albert would reach out to the rat, wasn't afraid. But then eventually, because of classical conditioning, his response would be different, right? Every time he reached out to the rat, John Watson would strike a hammer against an iron bar, producing a horrible noise that would cause baby Albert to cry. This happened enough times that baby Albert then began to associate this horrible sound with the rat, right? And then just being presented with the rat, not even hearing the noise, would be enough to make baby Albert cry. So classical conditioning is basically the pairing of two stimuli, right? Thus forming an association between the two. So in this case, it had worked. Baby Albert had a phobia of rats instilled into him. More than that, the fear was generalizable. Okay, when presented with a white rabbit, he would also cry. Okay, so his fear generalized to all kind of white furry creatures. Okay, obviously an unethical study by today's standards, right? There was no effort to uncondition baby Albert, so he likely would have gone on to be afraid of rats and other white furry creatures for some time to come. In fact, we don't actually know what the long-term effects were. Baby Albert died shortly after the experiment of a brain aneurysm, okay? So we don't actually know what the long-term effects would have been, but we can assume, okay, that at least for a period of time, he would have gone on to have this fear of rats and so on. So, you know, in John Watson's idea, classical conditioning really explains everything, okay? From the preferences you have, your likes, your dislikes, your tastes, any fears, phobias you have, okay? If you have a fear of dogs, for example, it therefore has to be because of some past experience that you can trace back, okay? Maybe being bit by a dog or something like this, okay? So that's a pairing, right, between feeling pain and being presented with a dog. It's then causing you to be fearful of dogs. So all likes and dislikes, according to John Watson, can be traced back to something in classical conditioning, okay? Now, B.F. Skinner had a less narrow view on learning, okay? He acknowledged that some behaviors were respondent behaviors, behaviors that are automatic, that might be a product of classical conditioning, or might be a little bit more innate. So for example, if you touch, you know, a hot pan or something really hot, you'll immediately remove your hand, right? Okay, it's an automatic behavior you don't have to consciously think of. You don't have to tell yourself to do it. It's automatic. So for B.F. Skinner, some behaviors are respondent behaviors, often a product of classical conditioning, but there are also operant behaviors, okay? Behaviors that we're more consciously aware of, that are in response to incentives, rewards, or fear of punishments, okay? And this is where operant conditioning comes in, okay? But this is when the learner's a slightly more active participant in the learning process, okay? Because some things will matter more or less to someone versus someone else, right? Whereas in the classical conditioning model, everyone's treated the exact same, okay? In classical conditioning, everyone is a passive vessel, okay? Just learning passively, purely a product of their environment. In operant conditioning, it matters what values to the person, okay? Because we're now changing behavior through rewards and punishments, or promises of rewards and punishments, okay? There's a reason as to why in Soviet Russia under Stalin, the only psychology theory that could be taught was a distorted version of Pavlovian theory, okay, that taught that classical conditioning explained everything, okay? Because this was the theory of psychology that was congruent with the political narrative, right? That individual capabilities and so on don't matter. There's no such thing as predispositions. Anything you have in your life is a product of your environmental experiences, okay? Any other psychology theory would at least somewhat challenge this. So in operant conditioning, there's really 4 types of learning, right? We have positive reinforcement, which is rewarding, encouraging behavior by presenting some positive stimulus. So B.F. Skinner initially tested this in the Skinner box on rats and pigeons, okay? So in the Skinner box, that would be the rats pressing the right lever in order to get a piece of food, encouraging them to press that lever again in the future, okay? And people, it could be, giving a kid a gold star or, something else that tells them a job well done, okay, for positive behavior, thereby encouraging it to continue. Or, maybe giving an employee a bonus, okay, for doing well at their job, thereby encouraging them to, repeat that behavior in the future. And then there's positive punishment, okay, so discouraging behavior by presenting some negative stimulus, some punishment, okay. So in the Skinner box, the rat would be electrocuted if it pressed the wrong lever, okay, discouraging it from pressing that lever in the future. In people, it could be any sort of punishment, okay, that you present them with, right? Smacking a young kid or some other form of punishment, right? And then we have negative punishment, okay, which is removing a positive stimulus. Again, is a form of punishment, okay? We're removing something that's valued. So this could be, for example, when you're a teenager, having your phone taken away, okay, as punishment from your parents, or having your TV privileges removed, right? Something like that. And then there's negative reinforcement, okay, which is the removal of a negative stimulus to encourage behavior, okay? So in the Skinner box, there would be a horrible noise, and if the rat pressed the right lever, that noise would stop, okay? And people, it might be avoiding sunburn by putting on sunscreen, right? You've been taught that if you apply sunscreen, you're less likely to get burnt, so you do so again in the future, hoping to avoid this, punishment in this context, right? Hoping to remove this negative stimulus from the future. Okay, I'm going maybe a little bit quick, but I'm thinking these are ideas you're already pretty familiar with. Is there any questions so far? Okay. Now, when Skinner was initially observing this, the schedules of reinforcement were continuous, okay? Meaning that there was a reward or punishment after every single action, okay? The reinforcement schedule was continuous. But Skinner eventually realized that this isn't what happens in real life, right? A kid isn't given a gold star every single time they do something right. They aren't punished every single time they do something wrong. Rarely in life are reinforcement schedules actually continuous. So he then began to study the various forms of non-continuous reinforcement, okay? So there's 4 of these. The first is fixed interval reinforcement, which is when the reinforcement is given at a predictable interval, okay? So in the Skinner box, it might be the case that the lever becomes active on every hour, okay? So they can press it at 4 o'clock, they get a piece of food. They can then press it as many times as they want between 4 and 5, it won't matter, okay? The reinforcement won't come again for another hour. Once they press it again at 5 o'clock, they'll then get this piece of food again. So it doesn't have to be an hour, but the point is it's a predictable time frame, right? It's a consistent and stable predictor. Underneath this is variable interval, okay? When the reinforcer is delivered at unpredictable time intervals, okay? So this could be that the lever becomes active after 5 minutes, and then after an hour, and then after 20 minutes, okay? Now, what Skinner observed was that fixed interval reinforcement produced pretty stable learning, okay, evidence of learning. Variable interval reinforcement also produced fairly stable learning, but it was more minimal, okay? And you can think about this in people, right? Maybe, for example, you're in charge of a restaurant or a store or something like that, and every so often you get health checks or some inspection from higher management, okay? It could be 2 weeks from now, it could be 2 days from now, it could be a month from now. You don't know, okay? But most likely, what this variable interval reinforcement will produce is stable behavior, making sure that, everything's in line with the health checks and everything's up to standard, but it'll be fairly minimal. There's no point in going out of your way today because you might not get checked today. You might not get checked for 2 weeks. So there's no point in going above and beyond, right? Instead, you're going to do probably just the bare minimum that needs to be done every day. And then there's fixed ratio. So now it's about a predictable number of responses rather than a predictable time frame, okay? So it could be that the rat gets its piece of food after pressing the lever 100 times, or after pressing it 10 times, if that's the fixed number, okay? But the point is there's a fixed number that's, again, predictable and consistent and stable. So in people, it could be that you maybe get a bonus after 100 sales, okay? Or something such as this. There's a number you reach, and then you get your reinforcements, okay? Now, what Skinner observed was in fixed ratio reinforcement, the learning was less stable, okay? It would begin to rise the closer one got to receiving the reinforcement, and then it would dip after one gets the reinforcement, and then it would continue to rise again the closer you get to the next reinforcement, okay? And then dip after this, okay? So as you're anticipating the rewards, right, you're feeling even more encouraged and you're producing this learned behavior as much as possible. Once you've got the reward, well, that's going to keep you satisfied for some period of time. You know it's going to be a period of time you have to wait until you get the next one. And so behavior then is less produced. It's more minimal after you've got the reward. And then there's variable ratio, okay, which is again about the number of responses from the subject, but it's unpredictable, right? It might be the case that the rat gets a piece of food after pressing the lever once, and then they press it 5 times and get a piece of food, then 3 times get a piece of food, then once get a piece of food, then 20 times get a piece of food, okay? That's after a number of responses, but it's unpredictable. Now, what Skinner observed was that this produced pretty addictive behavior, if you like, okay? That the rat would become pretty fixated on pressing the lever, okay? Not really knowing when it's going to get the food, always anticipating the food. And this would really be used to explain why gambling and so on can be pretty addicting, right? Anything that's about chance, like the lottery or roulette or any sort of gambling, is a good example of variable ratio reinforcement, okay? If you play the odds enough times, you'll eventually get a payout, okay? But it's unpredictable to an extent when you're going to get the payout. Okay, any questions on these? These 4 schedules make sense? But Skinner acknowledged, okay, that some behaviors are too challenging or difficult to be directly observed and then directly reproduced following a reward, okay? This could be, for example, learning to drive a car. You don't watch someone drive a car and then do so perfectly yourself, okay, when given the promise of a reward. But Skinner mainly used this idea to explain language, okay, language production. So it's shaping, okay, in which there are reinforcements given to approximations of the desired behavior, okay? So, you want the child to say mummy, for example. They don't say mummy initially, but, they say mama or, something that's vaguely resembling it. You encourage them with that, you give them praise, you give them smiles, you give them some sort of reward in that sense. And then that encourages them to give some other approximation. And if they're encouraged again, the approximations will get closer and closer and closer to the actual desired product, okay? So this is what shaping is, okay? There's successive approximates that are becoming increasingly similar to the final goal, and continuing to be encouraged. Now, for Skinner, shaping, being able to make approximations, is also how we learn to become socialized and how we learn to make generalizations and discriminations. Okay, so discrimination is being able to tell the difference between what will give you a reward and what will give you a punishment. Okay, and generalization is generalizing the fact that this thing gave a reward, and therefore things approximately similar to it will also give a reward, whereas this thing gave a negative, this thing gave a punishment, and so things approximately similar to this also will give a punishment, okay? And so through this generalization is part of how we're socialized according to Skinner, because not every single behavior, has to be experienced and encouraged or discouraged for you to learn that you should or shouldn't do it, right? You don't have to beat someone up and then get punished for it to learn you're not supposed to beat people up, right? It's something that you can make an approximation over through generalization over what's acceptable, what's not acceptable behavior, right? Not everything has to be encouraged or discouraged in this way. In fact, most things to do with what's right and what's wrong are not directly experienced, right? You don't have to trip your grandmother down the stairs, right, and be punished for it to realize, oh, turns out I'm not supposed to trip my grandmother down the stairs, right? It's something that you can guess for yourself through making approximations, okay, over what's been encouraged behaviors, what's been discouraged behaviors in your past. And then in Skinner's 1953 book, he listed a range of self-control techniques. Now, importantly, when Skinner talks about self-control, he's not talking about a personality trait or any sort of internal construct like that, okay? We're not talking about, a robust superego like Freud would have, or a stable personality trait like conscientiousness, like in the Big Five. Skinner is giving no acknowledgement, okay, to any abstract ideas or personality traits or any internal constructs. He's only interested in that which is observable, okay, that which is overt. So when he talks about self-control, what he is talking about is controlling variables in your environment that might otherwise influence your behavior, okay? So the ways of doing this are, first of all, physical restraint. Okay, so if you restrain yourself, it's less likely that you'll engage in a particular behavior. So for example, you want to stop biting your nails, so you put your hands in your pockets, okay? That would be a good way of physically restraining yourself from doing that behavior. Otherwise, maybe if your hands were right here, you might be tempted to bite your nails if that's something you're trying to stop. Changing the stimulus is out of sight, out of mind. You want to eat better, so, put that chocolate bar inside a cupboard so you can't see it anymore, right? Whereas if it was in sight, maybe you would be tempted to eat it, okay? So it's removing the stimulus, okay, from sight, so it's less likely to influence you. And then the next two are either about starving yourself or making yourself sick of a stimulus. So deprivation is the former, okay? This is depriving yourself of a particular stimulus, so you're more likely to want to capitalize on it in the future. So for example, maybe you're going to a buffet tonight, and so you decide you'll skip lunch, okay, making yourself extra hungry, and therefore you'll take full advantage of the buffet tonight, okay? And then we have the opposite, making yourself so sick of a stimulus that it's no longer going to have an enticing effect on you, okay? So, chain smoking is one technique that smokers might use to try and stop smoking, okay? When they smoke and smoke and smoke until they're physically sick, okay, hoping that that will then discourage them from wanting a cigarette in the future. And then manipulating emotional conditions, okay? Trying to change your levels of arousal or your current emotions so you might respond differently to an upcoming situation. So if you have a big game, for example, then trying to get yourself upbeat, trying to get yourself excited in a positive mood, okay? Or if you've got, a job interview, trying to make sure that you're not nervous, trying to tell yourself that you're calm and collected, okay? But trying to do something, okay, that changes your emotional states, okay? Thereby, changing how you might react in this upcoming event. And then aversive stimulation, trying to avoid an adverse situation by setting it up this way in advance. So, for example, maybe you're going on a diet and you tell all your friends that you're going on a diet because that way you might be more likely to stick to it because you don't want the kind of embarrassment of having to say that, well, I couldn't stick to, the routine that I set for myself. Okay, so by this way, by trying to set up a situation in which you might be embarrassed if you fail, you're thereby maybe less likely to fail. Okay. Drugs is taking some sort of medication or something to change your behavior, right? So, ADHD medication or anti-anxiety medication, or any sort of drug really that might have then an influence on your behavior, but you're, doing this deliberately. And then we have self-reinforcement and self-punishment, giving yourself some small reward or some punishment, hoping to encourage or discourage this from happening again. So, you did very well today at school, or you did very well today at work, or whatever it is. And so you decide to give yourself some reward, maybe, a piece of candy or a small treat or whatever it is that might be a reward to you. This would be some self-reinforcement. And then maybe self-punishment could be, for example, pinching yourself if you bite your nails, if you're trying to stop, some maybe physical punishment or something else that's going to discourage you, hopefully, from doing that again in the future. And then stimulus avoidance is removing yourself from a stimulus. So there's music playing, you don't like the music, so you remove yourself from the room. Okay. So to be clear, the difference between the second one and the last one is that changing the stimulus is removing the stimulus from you. The last one is removing yourself from the stimulus. Okay. Obviously very similar. Some future behaviorists grouped these together. Okay, but in Skinner's categories, that's the distinction. Okay. Now, Skinner was not a psychotherapist of any sort. Okay, he thought that Freud's talk therapy was one of the things making psychology unscientific. Okay, but still, there's been a lot of ideas applied based upon his research and so on. Behavior modification techniques, right? Using rewards and punishments to change people's behavior, sometimes in a therapeutic setting, sometimes in other settings like in education, and in businesses and so on, right? It's a pretty well-used idea now, okay, to use rewards to encourage behaviors, potential punishments to discourage behaviors. These are usually about using rewards. There's some exceptions about using punishments. So, for example, some sort of aversion therapy, right? This could be mild. So, for example, if you want to stop biting your nails, you can get one of these, horrible tasting things to put on your nails so that every time, you do bite your nails, it will be distasteful, okay? It will be, well, it will be uncomfortable, right? And so that's going to discourage you, hopefully, from wanting to do it again in the future. And then there's more extreme forms of aversion therapy, right? Like electric shock therapy, conversion therapy that was pretty common from the 1970s to the 1990s, when homosexuality was illegal. Quite often part of the punishment would be watching pornography that, was deemed to be unacceptable at that time. And then the person would be given electric shocks during it, hoping that the negative association would discourage, this sexual interest in the future. Now, these forms of aversion therapy are not very successful, okay? All of these types of electric shock therapy, conversion therapy were unsuccessful. And even the more mild forms, like the one I just told you about biting your nails, and then putting on, something to discourage this on your nails, these can have short-term effects, but very rarely do they have long-term effects, okay? Especially once one no longer fears the punishments, okay? Once, the presence of the punishment is no longer there. what we find in operant conditioning is that rewards work much better than punishments when it comes to modifying behavior, especially if you're looking for long-term effects. Now, in one of the best known studies on Skinner's idea, it's the token economy study. There was a group of women, 40 of them, who were in an institution, or called an asylum at that time, in some ways psychologically disturbed, and they had been incredibly institutionalized. Okay, they did nothing for themselves. You know, they didn't make their own beds, they didn't make their own food. In many cases, they didn't even dress themselves or comb their own hair or brush their own teeth. They had workers at the institution who would do everything for them. And the goal of the experiment was to modify behavior, okay, by giving rewards. And so every time they did something for themselves, you know, made their own bed, got themselves dressed and so on, they were given a token. And the tokens could be exchanged for things like chocolate bars or entrance into a movie night, okay, some sort of, you know, appealing reward, okay, at the institution. Now, what the results of this were that there were pretty strong short-term effects, okay? The women did learn to do things for themselves without having to be tended to all the time. But once the experiment stopped, okay, they fairly quickly went back to the way things were, okay? So there wasn't this long-term effect. And when they were released from the institution, they also weren't showing signs of improvement. But after this initial study, there were a number of modifications on the idea, you know, changing up the types of rewards, for example. And in some studies, the rewards were more psychological in nature rather than being about, you know, financial incentives or material rewards, okay? They were, for example, giving hugs or smiles or giving encouraging words, telling them a job well done. And kind of reviews of this reveal that the more psychological rewards had more long-term effects than the more financial incentives did. So there's a number of examples of positive reinforcement changing behavior, right? If you have the textbook, it lists, I'm sure, quite a number of them, but you could easily find many examples. Okay, I've just listed a couple here to illustrate the point, but you know, in one study, children with ADHD showed more motivation to learn in the classroom when they were given immediate reinforcements for keeping their attention on task. In one study, children were better behaved on a school bus once they were given rewards for behaving well on the school bus. And many other examples, right, following a similar idea, right, that you can encourage good behavior through giving rewards. That said, despite the clear applications of Skinner's ideas, there's some parts of the behavioral perspective that are undoubtedly incorrect, okay? The philosophy that people come into the world as blank slates is just simply not correct, okay? I'll talk to you more about twin studies and adoption studies and so on later in the course, but we know that there are such things as genetic predispositions. You know, even from an early age, infants respond differently to the same situations, okay? There is such a thing as biology having an impact, right, on one's behavior, one's thoughts, one's feelings, and so on. And not everything can be traced back, right? Not every single phobia, for example, is due to some past negative experience, okay? The most obvious example of this is a fear of snakes, okay, that's found across countries. Even in individuals who have never seen a snake in person, maybe only read about them in books and seen them in TV and so on. But even animals, caged animals who have been caged their entire life, never seen a snake before, will show a lot of fear, jump at the sight of a snake, okay? It seems to be pretty well built into many animals, okay, to have this fear response when they see a snake, or even something that resembles a snake, okay? From an evolutionary point of view, that would make sense. because snakes can strike very quickly, okay? And so the reaction has to be automatic. It has to be even quicker, okay, than the snake's strike if you want to avoid getting bit, okay? So it has to be something that's kind of well built into the person. Moreover, a number of Skinner's former students did a study in which they had 6,000 animals across 38 different species. And what they found was that the more instinctive behaviors, okay, were always harder to challenge, always harder to modify or change, okay, than any sort of learned behavior, okay, that was a product of reinforcement. But, you know, not every person who's got a fear of dogs was bit by a dog in their past, right? Not every single thing like this can be traced back to some past experience, okay? But overall, Skinner's ideas have had a lot of research on them. His ideas are very, very testable, you know, in comparison to many of the other theorists we've looked at. You know, his ideas lend themselves very easily to scientific testing. And it's had a large impact on future theorists, okay? I'm going to talk next about social learning perspectives, which is seen as a much better perspective than the behavioral perspective, but it's arising out of the behavioral ideas, right? It's extending those ideas, improving upon some of those ideas. And many of these ideas continued to be used and applied in classrooms for education purposes, in the workplaces, in clinical settings, and so on. A weakness is that it uses animals as subjects. Again, we'll see that social learning theorists improved upon this. People are not born as blank slates. There's no acknowledgement here of biological influences. It's also a very simplistic view on people, on how they learn, and pretty negative, also believing that there's no such thing as free will, that people are products of their environments. And as we'll see, it's challenged by the cognitive movement, okay, that it's not just the case that, you know, you passively experience something and then reproduce that behavior. You know, there's processes in between observing and producing, okay, happening within your mind, okay, that cognitive processes can help make sense of. So the social learning theories are arising out of behavioral ideas, but really looking to improve upon them, okay, acknowledge some of these weaknesses. So in social learning theory, the learner is an active role in the learning process, okay? It doesn't have to be the case that something happens to them and then therefore they're going to act this way in the future, because people might respond differently to some situations. Some people might value things differently than others. And also, it doesn't have to be the case that something directly happens to you, right? In classical conditioning and operant conditioning, you would only learn if you're the one it's directly happening to. In social learning, you can watch something happen to someone else and learn this way, okay? You can learn vicariously through someone else. So it recognizes a distinction between acquisition and performance. You know, in the classic behavioral view, if you don't perform a behavior, you didn't learn it. But in social learning theory, they acknowledge that maybe you did learn it, you just chose not to perform that behavior, right, for some other explanation. It focuses on people rather than animals, therefore focusing on learning that matters to people, like problem solving. And it recognizes that behaviors can become fixed, okay? So, you know, in classical conditioning and in operant conditioning, the effects are fairly short-term, okay? So in order for there to be permanent behaviors, if you like, there has to be continuous reinforcement, okay, or continuous association in classical conditioning, right? Eventually, the dogs stopped producing saliva to the sound of the bell. Once the bell was no longer paired with food, it only lasted for some period of time, okay? If the association isn't still present after a period of time, the effects will wear out, okay? But social learning theory recognizes that sometimes habits can be amassed, okay? That sometimes you can keep doing a behavior not because it's always being reinforced, okay, but because it's becoming a more closer part of you. And that it's mediated by cognitive factors, okay, that I'll go on to discuss more. Now, there were a number of behavioral learning theories that emerged after B.F. Skinner. Okay, Dollard and Neal, for example, had the hierarchy theory, which is basically that everyone has a hierarchy of behaviors, and the position in the hierarchy is how probable it is that you'll perform this behavior. And these behaviors move up as a product of encouragements or rewards, and they move down the hierarchy as a consequence of punishments or being discouraged. So, for example, how likely are you to dance? According to Dollard and Neal, in a situation, if you are quite likely to dance, then it's high in your hierarchy. It must have been positively reinforced through rewards at some point. If it's at the kind of midpoint, then maybe you haven't had much conditioning to do with dancing. If it's low in the hierarchy and you're not at all likely to dance, then maybe it's been discouraged, it's been punished in some way earlier in the past. Okay, and then behaviors can move up and down the hierarchy based upon new reinforcements. And a lot of these theories were incredibly popular in the second half of the 20th century. But Bandura's theory is really the one that's stood the test of time, okay? The one that's still well taught and studied today. He's the one who's had the most influence on shaping social learning theories that came after him. So he's studied at British Columbia, actually studied psychology purely by chance. He didn't have a car. His roommates did have a car, and so he wanted a lift to college. They were studying engineering, and psychology was the only class on at the same time as engineering. So he decided, well, I'll take psychology. But ended up liking it a lot more than he expected, and that's ended up being what his graduate programs were in. In 1952, graduated with his PhD, and then went on to be a very well cited researcher. Got the Life Achievement Award in 2006 from the American Psychological Foundation. So he's still putting importance on Skinner's ideas, okay? Classical conditioning, operant conditioning are still ways of learning, okay? But also Bandura is opening up this other idea of learning, observational learning or vicarious learning, okay? So learning by watching someone else, okay? Watching a model and then mimicking their behavior. And then he also has this idea of reciprocal determinism, which I'll come back to give you some examples of. But the fact that the environment, your behaviors, your characteristics, these are all in interaction, they're all influencing each other. It's not just the case that the environment produces a behavior in you, okay? You're also interacting with the environment, and your characteristics also matter. So to demonstrate observational learning, the best known study he has is the Bobo doll study, showing modeling. Again, a study I'm sure you're familiar with. But in the original study, we have a group of children who watch adults play violently with a Bobo doll, and we have a group of children who don't watch this, and then all of the children are left alone with the Bobo doll. Those who watched the adults were more likely to behave aggressively with the Bobo doll, okay? Telling us that they were observing this behavior, that they were learning it, and then they're mimicking it themselves, right? Importantly, it didn't matter. In some variations, the children watched this in person, and sometimes they watched a video recording of it. It didn't matter, okay? Either way, they would learn the behavior and mimic the aggressive play behavior once they were left alone with the Bobo doll. Of course, in the study, the child doesn't know that they're being watched. They're being left alone with the Bobo doll. The observers behind one-way glass, right? They're watching the child. The child doesn't know this. They think that they're being left alone to play with the Bobo doll. Now, what Bandura observed also was that some factors influenced how likely it was that the child would mimic the behavior. Okay, characteristics of the model matter. If the model is perceived as being more similar in some way, so this could be in terms of age, sex, but some way of identifying with the model, okay, makes it more likely that the child or the learner will mimic the behavior. Also the status, of the model. If they're well dressed or appear to be someone of high status, well importance, it's more likely that the learner will mimic the behavior. Also characteristics to do with the learner or the observer. You know, if they're lower in self-esteem, lower in age, lower in confidence, all of this makes it more likely that they'll learn and mimic the behavior as well. And then unsurprisingly, rewards and punishments can also influence how likely one is to mimic the behavior. In the original study, the girls were less likely to mimic the aggressive behavior than the boys, okay? But once they were given the promise of a reward, you know, if you do what you watched the adults do, you'll be given a cookie. They were then just as rough and aggressive with the bobo doll as the boys, okay? So it wasn't the fact that they weren't capable of behaving aggressively, but maybe because of socialization, they maybe thought that there would be a punishment because maybe they had been taught that, you know, girls don't play roughly, they don't act aggressively. But once there was the promise of a reward, okay, once this behavior was encouraged, they would then repeat the observed behavior, okay? Now, in the process of observational learning, there are certain processes, okay, that are crucial. First of all, attention. You have to be encoding the information. You have to be paying attention to what's happening. You have to be watching the model if you're going to later mimic the behavior, right? Second is mental representation. So being able to visualize what was done, being able to store the memory, okay? You obviously have to be able to do this in order to then produce the behavior. This might be when, you know, some individual differences come into play, you know, differences in intelligence, or if it's a particular, depending on what the behavior is, right? Of course, but in some behaviors, it might be important that you're able to think abstractly, that you're able to have better intelligence in order to visualize what's exactly occurred. And then behavioral production is actually producing the behavior. And again, there's going to be individual differences, right? Because motor skills might come into it, athletic abilities might come into it, right? If it's some sort of athletic skill that you're trying to perform after watching someone else, okay? So individual capabilities are going to matter at these stages. But then also motivation matters. One has to be motivated to learn in order for it to be likely they'll mimic the behavior successfully. And, you know, this influences all those previous stages. You're more likely to give attention to someone or something if you're motivated to learn about it, or if you have some intrinsic interest in it, right? You're also more likely to store the memory, visualize it, more so if you're motivated to produce this behavior, or again, if you're intrinsically interested in the idea. And as we'll see also, those who are more motivated are better at producing observed behavior as well, okay? Okay, and then his other main idea is this concept of reciprocal determinism, okay? That the environment, your behaviors, and your personal factors also are in interaction, okay? So yes, one of these can influence another. You know, for example, maybe it's hot outside, and so that influences you to put on sunscreen or to put on, you know, lighter clothing. So the environment can, of course, impact your behavior. But also all of these can interact with each other. You know, maybe, for example, you enjoy skiing, and so you're going skiing pretty often, and then you make friends with other people who are skiing, and then, you know, you do things with them because they become your friends. And so in that case, you know, that's influenced your later environments. But it could also occur the other way around. You know, maybe a kid moves to a town, everyone there skis, and so in order to make friends, the child themselves learns how to ski, and then they learn that they actually enjoy it, okay? And then in that case, their environment has influenced, you know, their future behaviors and what they're interested in. So all of these have the potential to influence each other because they're all in interaction. It's not just as simple as the environment having an impact on behavior, okay, which was the more classic behavioral view. Now, important throughout this is the concept of self-efficacy. Okay. Now, self-efficacy is your self-belief in a given task. So it differs from self-esteem. Self-esteem is a more generalized self-image you have that might be positive or negative, okay? But it's a general self-image. Self-efficacy is situation-specific, right? So you could have high self-efficacy for one subject, low self-efficacy for something else. And what Bandura has observed was that self-efficacy influences behavior quite a lot. You know, for example, a kid might tell themselves, I'm not any good at math. Their self-efficacy is low. And then maybe they do bad at math, not because they're not capable, but because their self-belief is low. And so that impacts their motivation and so on, okay? Now, it could be negative. It could be a negative thing to have a low self-efficacy, okay? But it doesn't have to be, depending upon what the thing is, right? I may think, for example, I'm not very good at baseball, right? My self-efficacy is low. It's not necessarily a detrimental thing in my life, okay? It's maybe just a realistic idea, okay? So you can have self-efficacy that's high for given things that you're good at and low self-efficacy for other things too. But the point here is that if you have low self-efficacy, it might negatively impact your motivation to do something, okay? Which, for example, in the school environments could be a negative thing, right? If you're wanting a child to learn and do as best as they possibly can at all subjects. Now, there's a number of examples of self-efficacy influencing behavior. I think a good example is from the literature on smoking. You know, if someone says that they want to quit smoking, success rates are not very high. There's about a 5 to 6% chance that they'll actually be successful at never having another cigarette if they say that they want to give up, and there's no sort of intervention. If there is a treatment, so nicotine patches, for example, success rate goes up to about 25%, okay? But that still means that the majority will be unsuccessful in terms of quitting smoking. But if we boost self-efficacy, so telling them you have some personality construct, like really good self-control, really good impulse control, that means you're more likely to be successful at quitting smoking than the typical person, okay? By boosting their confidence, their self-belief in this way, we get success rates that are more like 60%, okay? And that's on its own, that's not even paired with interventions like nicotine patches, okay? So a pretty powerful example, okay, of how self-belief can influence actual behaviors and outcomes. Now, Bandura also has a set of ideas on how behavior can be modified, but they're really all to do with influencing self-efficacy. Okay, that's really at the core of his ideas. Now, these are the main sources, according to Bandura, on how self-efficacy can be influenced. The first one is performance attainment. That's the simplest one. Okay, if I've done something before successfully, I believe I can do it again, right? My self-efficacy is going to be high if I've been successful in the past. So previous successful attainment is the most easy way of influencing self-efficacy. A number of studies on this, but in one, for example, students who were doing a series of tasks, if they were doing well and they were given positive feedback on the ones they had just done, they felt more motivated to continue doing the rest of the tasks and also did so with more competence than those who weren't given positive feedback. And then a vicarious experience. Okay, watching someone else be successful might also boost self-efficacy. But how similar you are in ability matters, right? You know, maybe I'm asked to score a basket in basketball for the first time ever, okay? And I have to watch someone else first. If it's someone else who's never played basketball before, and they're maybe similar heights and so on to me, and if they're successful, then maybe my self-efficacy will be high, right? So maybe I'll think, well, they did it on their first time, I can do it my first time too. Self-belief will be high. But if it's an unrealistic comparison, right? If I'm watching someone who's, you know, maybe 6.5 feet, and maybe they're, you know, a pro at basketball, then that's not really going to give me much encouragement that I can also be successful, right? So it has to be someone that you can compare yourself to realistically for it to really be successful. And then verbal persuasion is telling someone that they can, okay? Telling someone that they can be successful. So this is often employed by teachers, right? Telling students you can do whatever you set your mind to, okay? Whatever you try hard at, you can do. Again, this is only really influential if it's regarded as being realistic, okay? If the individual doesn't believe what's being sold to them, okay, then it won't have an impact. And then physiological and emotional arousal, okay? If you're feeling in a positive state, in a happy state, your self-efficacy is more likely to be high. If you're feeling incredibly nervous and agitated, on a physiological level and psychologically, then your self-efficacy is more likely to be low as a consequence. Okay. Any questions so far? These pretty simple ideas. Okay. So Bandura's behavior modification techniques, like I say, all have the same goal, which are about boosting self-efficacy. Okay. The first one is vicarious or overt modeling. Okay, so watching someone else be successful in order to boost your own self-belief. So in this study by Bandura in 1976, he had a group of children who all said they were afraid of dogs. Some of them watched other children play with dogs, some did not, okay? And then those who had watched the children play with the dogs, okay, were then more likely to believe themselves that they could go and play with the dogs without being harmed, okay, so that their fear was lower. So by watching someone else, you can boost your own self-belief, right? Guided participation then is participating in something that you're afraid of, but with the help of a guide. So for example, maybe you have a fear of snakes, and so you watch someone handle a snake, and then, they grab your hand and, they bring it over to the snake, and they're, gently and gradually letting you also touch the snake and teaching you also how to handle the snake just as they've done. Okay, so you're watching someone else and then you're being guided in participation also, okay, in a way of reducing fear. And then covert or cognitive modeling is having someone visualize something before they actually encounter it, okay? So, you're worried about this big game, you want to do well at this big game, so imagining them succeeding, okay? Telling themselves, imagine visualizing you scoring the basket or winning the game or whatever it is, okay? Hoping that that will increase their self-belief. It could also be used in therapy to deal with phobias, for example. Maybe you have a client who's got a fear of elevators. You're probably not on day one going to take them onto an elevator, shove them on and, take it off to the top floor, okay? Probably the step before that will be having them sort of visualize the scenario, okay? So, visualize yourself approaching the elevator, imagine yourself on the elevator, nothing's happening, okay? It's going to the top floor, you're getting off, you're completely fine. So visualizing something that scares you, okay, before actually encountering it, or visualizing something that you want to achieve to boost your self-belief. Now, again, there's plenty of evidence on the influence of self-efficacy, okay? I've just got some examples, but, students who reported higher levels of self-efficacy were more motivated in the classroom, had better attention, did better. Those with higher self-efficacy visualize themselves being successful in a wider range of careers, and so they report a higher number of career possibilities. On one large meta-analysis, there was a good positive relationship between high self-efficacy and job performance. So it's actually translating into outcomes, okay, that those who have higher self-belief do better. And then also in a training program, those with higher self-efficacy did better on the training program, okay, than those with lower self-efficacy. And again, you could find many examples, right, of self-efficacy, self-belief having an actual impact on outcomes, on behaviors, on motivation, on attention, okay? Also, some fairly good evidence of observational learning. Certainly, again, it's something that's often applied, right? If you give someone a good role model, that often does encourage good behavior. But a lot of this research has looked at the influence of the media. For example, does watching violent media make one more violent? Now, There's a lot of correlational studies that do show that those who are more likely to watch violent media, watch violent movies, play violent video games, are more likely themselves to be violent. What's the obvious limitation with that sort of research? It's a correlational finding. It doesn't imply causation. It might be the case that those who are more violent prone are more likely to watch violent films and play violent video games in the first place, right? But again, we have some longitudinal studies also, okay, that are better research designs. So in this case, we're seeing how much violent movies or how much violent video games one plays earlier in life, and then we're following up 10 or 20 years later to measure some antisocial tendency or violence proneness, okay? And again, we're finding a significant effect. And these studies come from various countries. It's a well-replicated finding on various age groups as well, from college students to high school students to elementary students. Some other research has focused on the fact that sometimes after riots on the news or violent sports are being watched, there might be an actual increase in violent rates or rates of violent crimes. In one extreme example, for instance, murder rates increased by 12% following riots that were highly covered in the news and championship boxing matches. Overall, the kind of conclusion on this literature is that it likely isn't the case that one watches violent behavior and then just mimics it, okay? But it might be the case that there is small accumulating effects. That if a child is watching, violent movies again and again, or playing violent video games again and again, they're somewhat desensitized to violence, okay? Their physiological response to violence is lessened and lessened, okay? Meaning that they're going to be less hindered, okay, when it comes to acting violently in the future because they've been more desensitized. There is also a smaller amount of research, but accumulating research, that also shows that it can have a detrimental effect on pro-social helping behavior. And actually that having children consume media with a pro-social message can do the opposite, that it can increase helping behavior and pro-social behavior. Okay. Now, some of you who have taken my forensic psychology class might know that my main area is in forensic psychology and looking at things that increase antisocial behavior tendencies and so on. My main criticism with this body of literature would be that most of it is focusing on hypothetical scenarios rather than actual outcomes of crime rates, for example. So usually what's happening in these studies is, we measure how much violent media is being consumed early in life, and then later in life, we give someone a hypothetical questionnaire or a questionnaire with hypothetical scenarios to fill out. So, for example, if you were in this situation, how likely is it you would behave violently? That's sort of the measurements being used, okay? And it might be the case that there is some association between violent media consumption and then being able to visualize yourself acting violently in the future, okay? But actual concrete evidence telling us that violent media consumption actually predicts crime rates or actual acts of violence, that sort of evidence is much less compelling, okay, than the former example I gave you. Okay, so Bandura has focused on people learning rather than animals. He's given attention to inner processes, and it's been well tested, has a lot of research to back it up, and it's got clear applications like role models and boosting self-efficacy. But it largely focuses on overt behavior. It's ignoring, again, other aspects of personality. Again, all of these theories are not really acknowledging personality traits or anything more abstract or any more internal constructs of personality. Again, we're still considering them personality theories because they're all about why behavior is different across people, right? It's why there's variation in behavior. But quite often also, these behavioral modification techniques might address the symptom, but not the underlying issue, right? So you're biting your nails, for example. So here's a behavioral modification technique to have you stop biting your nails. But maybe you're biting your nails because of anxiety, okay? And so we've dealt with the symptom, but you're still anxious. And so now this is going to be acted out in some other way. You'll still have some other issues, okay, that these behavioral modification techniques are not actually dealing with, okay? So they're dealing at things on a surface level, but not always at a deeper level, which is maybe where the root of the issue is. Again, it's very simplistic, and it's really ignoring biological influences, genetic predispositions, and so on. Okay, and here's really where Skinner and Bandura would fall on these big philosophical questions. Is there any questions on anything I've said so far? Okay, otherwise, I know I've covered a lot today, so I appreciate your attention, okay? And I'll see you next time.